They called her Curse long before they called her by her name. In the low fields of the South, where the cotton swayed heavy and the air carried the sting of sweat and ash, there lived a woman who did not speak. She moved like a shadow through the rows, her hands raw from endless picking, her body bent beneath the sun. But it was not the marks of labor that made her different. It was the silence, a silence so unbroken, so complete, it unsettled even the cruel men who claimed to own her. Her name was Sara, though few ever used it. To the masters, she was another body, another back to bend, another mouth to starve. To the overseers, she was a problem because their whips could not pull a cry from her throat. To the other slaves, she was a mystery wrapped in grief, a woman whose eyes carried storms but whose lips never moved. And in the evenings, when the day's labor had finally broken every bone and breath, Sara would sit alone by the dying fires, staring into embers that seemed to remember everything she would not say. The truth lay buried in scars older than the fields themselves. Years before, the man she loved had been sold to another plantation, chained and hauled away until he was nothing but dust on the horizon. Their newborn child, still slick with birth, had been taken from her arms and drowned in a barrel of water to save the master the cost of feeding another mouth. That night, something inside her collapsed, and silence became her shield. She had not spoken since. And yet, silence was never truly empty. It carried weight. It carried questions. It carried fear. When she passed, whispers followed her. Some said she was touched by spirits, that she could bend misfortune with a glance. Others said her silence was proof she had bargained with the devil himself. And though none dared confront her openly, every whip, every brand, every chain dug deeper, as though they might force her grief to cry out, and in that cry, prove her human again. But Sara did not cry. And in the stillness of those fields, beneath skies that bruised before every storm, a question began to grow. What becomes of a woman who has nothing left to lose and a silence that nothing can break? It was in the haze of a burning dusk, when smoke curled from the harvest fires and clung to the air like ghosts, that a boy wandered where he should not have gone. His steps were unsteady, his small hands streaked with dirt, and his cheeks shone with the rawness of punishment. He was the master's son, pale as milk, eyes wide with a fear he did not yet understand. No one followed him. No one stopped him. And in his stumbling, he found himself at the edge of the slave quarters, where the air was thicker, heavier, and every breath seemed stolen from another's lungs. There, beneath the shadow of the smokehouse, sat Sara. Her wrists were bound in old scars, rings of iron memory etched into her flesh, and her gaze was fixed on nothing, as if she were staring through the world itself. The boy halted, caught in the gravity of her stillness. In her silence, he saw something both terrifying and safe, a quiet that seemed to absorb his tears. He approached, trembling. His lips parted, but the words caught, breaking instead into small, helpless sobs. And then, for the first time in years, Sara moved her mouth. One word passed through, low and fragile as drifting ash. Hush. The boy froze. The sound was not stern, not sharp, but soft, almost tender. He stopped crying, as if the single syllable had stolen the noise from him. His breath slowed, and in the dark of her shadow, his sobs faded into her silence. For reasons he could not name, he returned to her in the nights that followed. He smuggled her crumbs of bread wrapped in cloth, pieces of bruised fruit he had hidden from his father's table. In return, she gave him something that was not quite words, soft humming, broken rhythms that lingered like morning songs, rising and falling in a voice that carried the ache of centuries. But plantations are places where secrets cannot stay buried. A boy seeking a slave in the night was a seed of suspicion, and suspicion grows fast in soil already poisoned with fear. Soon, whispers curled through the quarters like smoke through rafters, whispers that Sara had caught the boy in her spell, that her silence was not silence at all but sorcery. And in a land ruled by cruelty, whispers were deadlier than chains. The nights turned colder, and with each one, the boy found his way back to her shadow. He carried stolen offerings clutched in his small fists, crusts of bread hard as stone, half-rotten apples, once even a strip of salted pork wrapped in cloth. He would set them before her, his pale fingers trembling with the guilt of theft, and Sara would lower her gaze, her silence wrapping around him like a secret he could not share with anyone else. In return, she gave him sound but not words. A low humming, rising from her chest like the echo of rivers buried deep beneath the earth. The songs had no language he knew, yet they calmed him, drew the sting from his punishments, and lulled him into a strange, heavy peace. One night, in the faint glow of the quarter's dying fire, the boy reached out and brushed the edge of her wrist. It was then he saw them, the rings of scars circling her skin, iron deep and unhealed though years had passed. He pulled his hand away as if burned, but Sara lifted her arm slowly, letting him see. Then she turned her shoulder, pulling the rough cloth of her dress aside, just enough to reveal a mark scorched into her flesh. The master's brand, seared like ownership into cattle. The boy trembled. He had never been told these things, had never been shown that pain could be written into a body. He wanted to ask her why she had no voice for such agony, but her eyes met his, and the silence answered for her. In the nearby cabins, others watched, some with pity, some with fear, but most with dread. They whispered in low voices that did not rise above the crackle of the fire. They knew this pattern. They had seen it before. When the master's blood mingled too close with the shadows of the quarters, there was no mercy, no kindness, only blood. Sara had not touched the boy beyond the brush of scarred flesh, but the thread between them was visible all the same, taut and glimmering like wire drawn too tight. The women avoided sitting near her, their children pulled back when she passed. Men averted their eyes. To be near her now was to invite danger, to tempt the master's wrath. Sara sat alone, the boy's quiet devotion her only company. But fragile kindness is a dangerous fire. It warms for a moment, then sets the whole field ablaze. And in the silence of her song, the seed of ruin was already sprouting. The whispers did not stay in the cabins. They traveled on the wind, curling like smoke through the halls of the big house, finding eager ears hungry for blame. They said the cattle had fallen ill because of Sara. They said the boy's restless dreams were her doing, that his pale skin had grown thinner since he had begun to slip into the quarters at night. Whispers are small things, but on a plantation, they spread like rot through wood, unseen and unstoppable, until the whole structure bends beneath them. Yet the truth of Sara's silence was far crueler than the tales. Once, she had been a young wife, her heart bound to a man who worked the same fields. Their hands had found each other in the rows of cotton, their laughter hidden in dark corners when no overseer watched. They had dreamt of freedom together, though neither dared speak of it aloud. But dreams were fragile things in a place built on chains. The day came when he was sold, his wrists bound in iron, his body dragged toward a horizon that swallowed him whole. Sara had tried to follow, only to be struck down by the whip. The sound of the wagon wheels rolled over her like thunder, leaving silence in their wake. That same year, she bore child. For a moment, hope flickered, small as a candle flame. But the master declared the baby a burden too costly to feed. They tore the infant from her arms before its first cry had ended, and with ruthless efficiency, drowned it in a water barrel. The scream that ripped from Sara's chest that night was the last sound she ever made. From then on, she became stone. Her lips closed. Her voice buried itself deep, never to surface again. But grief, when carried long enough, turns into something else. It becomes a presence, a shadow that clings, a storm that waits. Those who looked into Sara's eyes saw more than sorrow. They saw defiance disguised as silence, a refusal to give her captors the satisfaction of her cries. That was enough to terrify them. A slave who refused to break was dangerous. A woman who would not plead was something unnatural. So when the master heard of the boy in the quarters, he did not see innocence. He saw witchcraft, rebellion, contamination of his bloodline. And he named Sara not as a woman, but as a devil's bride, cursed and untouchable. And when a man gives a woman to the devil, The noose is never far behind. They drag her out at dusk, when the sky had bruised itself into deep purples and the air promised storm. Chains rattled as they bound her wrists to the whipping post, her back exposed to the eyes of all who lived upon that cursed soil. The field hands were forced to gather, their bodies pressed together in trembling silence. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, men lowered their heads, and the boy, pale and frantic, was shoved to the front to watch. The master wanted an audience, for cruelty meant little unless it was witnessed. A fire had already been stoked, its orange tongues reaching high into the darkening air. From within it glowed the iron, a curved piece of metal marked with the master's initials. The overseer held it in the flames until it turned the color of the setting sun, until the air itself seemed to shudder with the heat. The smell of burning wood and sweat thickened, and dread settled heavy as stone. The master shouted his charges, voice cutting through the dusk like a blade. He called Sara a sorceress, a corrupter, the hand of Satan placed among them. He claimed her silence was proof of a pact, her eyes proof of possession. The boy tried to cry out, his voice cracking, but the back of a hand silenced him. The slaves stood mute, knowing their own lives hung by the same thread. Then the brand was pressed into her flesh. The sound was not of scream, but of searing skin, a hiss that filled the air like the breath of hell itself. The smell of her burning shoulder rolled out in waves, sickening and unforgettable. But Sara did not cry. She did not move. Her body held still, her silence unbroken. The iron left its mark, a deeper scar upon a canvas already carved by chains and whips. Her silence spread through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Men shifted uneasily, women gripped their children tighter. Even the overseers faltered for a breath, unnerved by her refusal to scream. For in her eyes was not submission, not fear, but something vast, something eternal. It was as though she stared through them all, into a place no lash could reach, no brand could mark. And in that gaze, for the first time, they feared her. What they had meant as humiliation had instead crowned her in a terrible silence. And deep in the gathering storm, the air itself seemed to whisper that chains alone would no longer hold her. The night came heavy with rain clouds, the kind of dark that swallowed the stars whole. Thunder muttered at the edge of the fields, and the air felt thick, as if the storm itself was waiting for something to break. In the quarters, while the others slept in uneasy silence, the boy crept through shadows with trembling hands clutching a stolen key. His face was streaked with fear, but his eyes carried the kind of fire only children know, the fire of impossible hope. Sara sat chained in the corner of the barn, her body bent but her silence unbroken. The boy rushed to her side, fumbling with the lock, whispering words too fast to hear. His small hands shook as the iron clinked, and for the briefest moment, freedom seemed possible. But freedom on a plantation was a fragile dream, quick to shatter. They caught him before the chain could fall. The overseers stormed in like wolves, their lanterns slicing through the dark, their fists striking down the boy with vicious efficiency. His cry cut through the night, a sound that split Sara's chest open, though her lips stayed sealed. They dragged him away, pale arms flailing, his face contorted in terror. Sara lunged, but the chains yanked her back, iron biting into her wrists until blood ran fresh. By the time the boy was tied in the center of the barn, the master had arrived. His face was carved from stone, his voice sharpened by fury. He declared the child bewitched, poisoned by Sara's silence. He struck his own blood, and each blow echoed in the rafters, carrying a cruelty deeper than the storm outside. Then they turned on her. They forced Sara to her knees, her face pressed into the dirt before the boy's wide, wet eyes. The master demanded she speak. Just one word, a confession, a plea, any sound to prove she was human and not demon. The lash struck her back again and again, tearing skin into ribbons, drawing rivers of blood that stained the straw beneath her. Still she did not scream. Still she gave him nothing. The barn walls groaned with the storm outside. Lightning flashed, throwing shadows across her torn body, across the boy's bound frame. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. For in her silence, there was defiance. In her silence, there was something larger than the master's rage. And the question grew, trembling in every heart that watched. How long can silence hold back the storm before it explodes? The storm finally broke at midnight. Rain hammered the fields. Lightning split the sky into pieces, and thunder rolled like war drums. But inside the barn, another storm was born, a storm made by men. The master, red with drink and rage, declared the boy must burn, his weakness purged in fire. No scripture was read, no mercy offered. Only dry straw was piled high, and oil was poured as if the barn itself were a sacrifice. Sarah's chains clinked in the corner, her wrists raw and torn, her silence still unbroken. She watched in frozen horror as the torches were raised. The boy's cries, thin, desperate, carried through the rafters, twisting the air into knives. She strained against her bonds until iron bit bone. For the first time since her child was drowned years ago, her eyes brimmed not just with sorrow, but with fury. The torches dropped. Flames leapt like beasts, devouring straw, wood, and air. Smoke roared upward, choking the night. The boy screamed, calling for her, calling for the woman who had given him wordless songs in the dark. And something inside Sarah shattered. The silence she had carried like a coffin cracked open. A sound tore from her chest, deeper than words, sharper than steel. A howl that rattled the very beams above her head. With that cry, she pulled, chains grinding, metal groaning. Years of quiet suffering gathered into one impossible force. The bolt tore loose from the post, and the barn shuddered as if struck by the storm outside. She staggered forward, half dragged by her own shackles, her hands blistering as she seized the boy's ropes. Fire licked her arms, smoke seared her lungs, but she pulled him free. She carried him out into the night, stumbling into the rain-soaked yard. Flames clung to her dress, burning holes into the fabric, but she did not stop. She fell to her knees in the mud, the boy cradled in her scarred arms. His body was limp, his face pale in the lightning's flash. His chest did not rise. His voice did not answer. Sarah's silence broke again, not with words, but with a cry so raw, so inhuman, that even the men who had set the fire stepped back. It was grief without language, a howl that belonged more to wolves than to women, echoing through the storm, echoing through the bones of every soul who heard it. And in that sound, the plantation trembled, as if something greater than fire and storm had finally been unleashed. By dawn, the storm had emptied itself, leaving the plantation drenched and broken. Smoke still coiled from the barn's blackened skeleton, its timbers standing like charred ribs against the pale morning sky. Ash floated on the breeze, soft as snow, falling across the fields where silence now ruled. No versang, no voice sterth. Only the faint crackle of smoldering wood lingered, whispering of the night's cruelty. Sarah was nowhere to be found. The boy's body had been taken from her arms in the chaos, but the men could not say where she had gone. Some swore they saw her running toward the river, shackles still clattering against her ankles, her burned dress trailing smoke like a dying torch. Others insisted she walked calmly into the woods, her silence heavier than the storm itself. And there were those who whispered she had vanished in the fire, not consumed, but carried by it, her body turned into ash that still drifted over the fields. The master gave no burial, no prayer, only orders. The slaves were forced to rake the ashes, to rebuild what the fire had devoured. Yet none of them spoke Sarah's name aloud. They moved like shadows, their eyes lowered, but in their silence there was a secret pulse, as if they had inherited her defiance. In the hush of the quarters, when night returned, mothers rocked their children and hummed the wordless tune she had once given the boy. Her voice, though never spoken, lived on in their breath. The legend grew quickly. They said her howl still echoed through the cypress when the wind turned cold. They said her footsteps were heard in the wet earth by the river, a chain dragging behind her, a cry always half-formed. Some claimed the storm that destroyed the barn had never left, that it waits in the sky for her to return. The master tried to erase her, forbidding her name, punishing any whisper of her story. But the more he silenced them, the stronger her shadow grew. For Sara had become more than a woman. She was grief made flesh, silence turned weapon, a reminder carved into the very bones of the land. And so the fields carried her memory. Long after the barn rotted, long after the master's line withered, her presence remained. A scar in the earth, a silence in the wind, a howl in the distance. They called it the horrifying case of Slave Sara. But to those who remembered, she was something else, the woman who turned her suffering into legend, and whose silence will never die.